He thought his life of danger ended when he left the Marines. But fate had one last mission for him, buried beneath the soil of a forgotten farm. When James inherited an old, abandoned property from a relative he barely remembered, he expected broken fences, maybe a few memories left behind. What he didn't expect was for his loyal dog to dig straight into a secret his family had hidden for generations. As dirt flew into the cold November air, what they uncovered would change everything. Not just his future, but the legacy of his entire bloodline. And when you see what was inside that box, you'll understand why he could never look at his dog the same way again. Do you think you would have kept the treasure? Or turned it in? Be honest, what would you have done if your dog dug up a box like this? James Sullivan had spent 20 years in the Marine Corps, serving tours in places most Americans only saw on news broadcasts: Iraq, Afghanistan, and several locations he still couldn't discuss even in retirement. The years had taught him resilience, discipline, and the value of simple pleasures: a hot meal, a safe place to sleep, the company of someone you could trust with your life. When he finally retired at 42, his body bearing the scars of service, but his mind still sharp, he expected to spend his days in quiet contemplation, perhaps working odd jobs to supplement his pension, slowly adjusting to a civilian world that often felt more foreign than the combat zones he'd left behind. What he didn't expect was the letter from Hamilton and Associates, a law firm in rural Pennsylvania, informing him that his great-uncle Howard Sullivan, a man he'd met only twice as a child at family gatherings he barely remembered, had passed away 6 months prior and left him a 150-acre farm in the Appalachian foothills. The letter was formal, apologetic for the delay in contacting him, and matter-of-fact about the condition of the property, abandoned for approximately 9 years and requiring substantial repair. James read the letter 3 times in his small apartment in Virginia, trying to process what it meant. He had no memories of Uncle Howard beyond a vague impression of an elderly man with weathered hands and a quiet demeanor who'd sat apart from the family at a funeral James had attended as a teenager. He'd never known about the farm, never been told he had any connection to rural Pennsylvania, never imagined he might inherit anything beyond his father's watch and his mother's recipe book. But a farm, 150 acres, land that had been in the Sullivan family for over a century. It felt like a message from a past he'd never known, an invitation to a future he hadn't planned. After 2 decades of following orders, moving where the Corps sent him, living out of barracks and temporary housing, the idea of owning something permanent, something rooted in earth and history, stirred something deep within him. The property sat 40 miles outside Pittsburgh, nestled in rolling hills where autumn painted the landscape in brilliant shades of amber, crimson, and gold. James made the drive on a cold October morning in his aging pickup truck, his German shepherd, Rex, panting happily in the passenger seat with his head out the window, ears flapping in the wind. Rex had been his companion for the past 3 years, a retired military working dog who'd served alongside him in his final deployment to Afghanistan. They'd saved each other's lives more than once. Rex had detected an IED that would have killed James's entire squad, and James had carried the injured dog 3 miles through hostile territory after a firefight. And now they were inseparable. Where James went, Rex went. It was that simple. As James turned off the main highway onto a narrow gravel road that wound through dense forest, towering oaks and maples that formed a canopy overhead, filtering the morning light into golden beams, he felt a mixture of anticipation and apprehension building in his chest. The lawyer had warned him that the property had been abandoned for nearly a decade. Uncle Howard had been a recluse in his final years, and after his death, the farm had sat empty while the estate went through the slow machinery of probate, slowly deteriorating with each passing season. When the farmhouse finally came into view at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, James understood what abandoned truly meant. The 2-story structure sagged under the weight of neglect, its white paint peeling in long strips like sunburned skin, revealing weathered gray wood beneath that had darkened with moisture and age. Several windows on the ground floor were broken, their glass scattered in the weeds below. Others were boarded up with plywood that had warped and split. The front porch tilted at a precarious angle, several of its support posts rotted through at the base. The roof showed missing shingles and patches, and James could see water damage around the eaves. The barn, about 50 yards behind the house, looked even worse. Its roof partially collapsed on the right side, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, its large doors hanging askew on broken hinges. Yet despite the decay, despite the overwhelming evidence of years of abandonment and neglect, James felt something stir within him. This place had history. It had bones. It had been built by hands that understood craftsmanship, constructed to last through generations. The foundation was stone. He could see that, not cinder block or poured concrete, but actual stone, quarried and fitted. The frame of the house, though weathered, showed the marks of old-growth timber, the kind that didn't exist anymore. More importantly, impossibly, this place was his, perhaps the first thing he'd truly owned since leaving his childhood home decades ago when he'd enlisted at 18. As he stepped out of his truck, the autumn air cool and crisp with the scent of decaying leaves and wood smoke from some distant neighbor's chimney, Rex bounded out beside him, immediately beginning to explore the overgrown yard with the enthusiasm of a dog half his 7 years. His tail wagged as he investigated every new scent, marking territory, establishing this as a space with the confidence of a dog who'd faced down enemies and survived. The property was vast, stretching beyond what James could see from the house. Overgrown fields rolled away in every direction, once cultivated land, now reclaimed by wild grasses that stood waist-high, saplings of maple and pine beginning to establish themselves where crops had once grown. An old stone wall stood near the barn, its wooden cover rotted through and dangerous, a dark opening that seemed to breathe cool, damp air. Farm equipment lay scattered about like the bones of some ancient creature slowly being absorbed back into the earth. A rusted tractor with flat tires and a cracked engine block, a hay baler with its mechanical guts exposed to the elements, various tools and implements James couldn't even identify, all slowly surrendering to rust and decay. A small orchard behind the house, perhaps 20 trees, stood in gnarled rows, unpruned for years, producing small, bitter apples that littered the ground. Beyond that, James could see the edge of a forest, thick and dark, marking the property's boundary. The land had potential, he could see that. With work, an enormous amount of work, it could be productive again. But the question was whether he had the energy, the resources, and the stubborn determination to bring it back from the edge. James spent that first day simply walking the property, taking inventory of what he'd inherited, making mental notes of everything that needed attention. He explored every accessible room of the house, stepping carefully on floors that creaked ominously beneath his weight, noting the extensive water damage in the upstairs bedrooms, the evidence of animal habitation in the kitchen, the surprising integrity of the main structural beams. The house, despite its appearance, had good bones. The foundation was solid stone that had held for over a century. The frame, though weathered, showed the craftsmanship of another era when builders took pride in their work and expected structures to last for generations. With work, a lot of work, more work than he'd done on anything since basic training, it could be restored. The barn was another matter entirely. Its partial roof collapse had allowed years of rain and snow to deteriorate the interior. Hay bales from Uncle Howard's final harvest had rotted into black, moldering masses. The wooden floor was soft with rot in places, dangerous to walk on. But the main frame still stood, massive timbers that spoke of the barn's original construction in an age when men knew how to build things that lasted. As evening approached, and long shadows stretched across the fields, painting everything in shades of amber and purple, James set up camp in his truck bed. He wasn't ready to spend the night inside the house, not until he'd properly assessed its safety, checked for structural issues that might cause a ceiling to collapse in the night or floors to give way. He'd learned in the military never to sleep somewhere without first confirming it was secure. Rex curled up beside him in the truck bed, his warm body a comforting presence, and together they watched the sun sink behind the distant hills, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold and red that seemed to set the clouds on fire. For the first time in months, maybe years, James felt something like peace settle over him. The constant tension he'd carried since leaving the service, the hypervigilance that made him scan every room for exits and threats, the difficulty sleeping in cities where every car backfire made him flinch. All of it seemed to ease slightly in this quiet place. There were no crowds here, no sudden noises, no sense of danger lurking around every corner. Just land, sky, and the companionable presence of a dog who understood him better than most humans. That night, as he lay in his sleeping bag listening to the sounds of the country, crickets singing their final songs before winter's arrival, distant owls hooting from the forest, the whisper of wind through dying leaves, and the occasional rustle of some small animal in the underbrush, James made a decision. He would restore this place. He would make a home, whatever it took, however long it required, however many obstacles stood in his way. He would honor his great-uncle's memory by bringing this forgotten farm back to life, by continuing whatever legacy the Sullivan family had begun here over a century ago. He had no idea that beneath his feet, buried in the earth that would soon occupy his days and consume his thoughts, lay a secret that would change everything. He didn't know that his great-uncle Howard, and perhaps generations before him, had kept something hidden, something valuable, something that had waited in darkness for someone worthy to discover it. He couldn't have imagined that within weeks, his faithful companion would lead him to a discovery that would connect him to his family's past in ways he'd never anticipated, that would provide the means to achieve the restoration he'd just committed to, that would turn an abandoned farm into something extraordinary. But that knowledge would come. For now, James Sullivan simply lay beneath the stars, listening to his dog's steady breathing beside him, and felt something he hadn't felt in his adult life. He felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of physical labor that left James exhausted each night, but oddly satisfied in a way his military service rarely had. There was something honest about this work, something pure about swinging a hammer or lifting lumber, about seeing tangible progress at the end of each day. He threw himself into the restoration with the same intensity he'd brought to every mission in the Marines, rising before dawn and working until darkness forced him to stop. He started with the house, because shelter was fundamental. He cleared out years of accumulated debris, animal nests for mice and raccoons, piles of leaves that had blown in through broken windows, water-damaged furniture too far gone to save, old newspapers and magazines from the 1990s that had moldered into unreadable pulp. He wore a respirator as he worked, knowing the dangers of mold and animal waste, hauling trash bag after trash bag out to a growing pile he'd eventually need to have removed. He patched the roof first, because every other repair would be pointless if water continued to pour in. He spent 3 days on a ladder, replacing missing shingles, sealing around the chimney, clearing gutters that had become gardens of saplings and decomposing leaves. It wasn't pretty work, but it was effective. The next rain, a cold, driving October storm, stayed outside where it belonged. Next came the windows. James couldn't afford new ones yet, so he carefully removed the broken panes, cleaned the frames, and installed plastic sheeting as temporary protection. It wasn't elegant, but it kept out the wind and rain. He reinforced the sagging porch, jacking it up carefully and installing new support posts, replacing rotted boards in the deck. Each repair was small, but together they began to transform the house from a derelict shell into something that resembled a home. The plumbing was shot. As he'd expected, frozen pipes had burst in several places during winters when the house stood empty and unheated. The electrical system was worse, a genuine fire hazard with cloth-wrapped wiring that dated back decades and jury-rigged repairs that made James cringe. These were problems that would require professionals, money he didn't have yet, but he could work around them temporarily. The old stone well still functioned, providing clean, cold water. He set up a camping stove in the kitchen and ran an extension cord from his generator to power lights and charge his phone. Rex adapted to farm life with surprising ease. Each morning, he'd patrol the property perimeter while James worked, following a route that became increasingly consistent, establishing his territory, checking for intruders or threats with the seriousness of a dog who'd spent years doing security work in combat zones. He'd return periodically to check in with James, accept a scratch behind the ears or a piece of jerky, then head out again. The dog seemed younger here, energized by the open space and freedom, no longer confined to the small apartment where he'd had to content himself with walks around the block. James would often pause in his work to watch Rex explore, grateful for the companion who'd stood by him through the hardest transitions of his life. They'd both come here broken in different ways, James with his nightmares and hypervigilance, Rex with his own trauma from service. And somehow this place seemed to be healing them both. By late October, as trees stripped themselves bare and the first frost painted the morning grass silver, the house was livable, barely. James had claimed the master bedroom upstairs, the one room that had escaped the worst of the water damage thanks to a solid roof section above it. He'd cleaned it thoroughly, repaired the plaster walls where they'd cracked, and moved in his few possessions, a military footlocker with his clothes, some books, his laptop, and a few photographs from his service. He'd set up a camping stove in the kitchen, where the old cast-iron sink still worked, fed by a hand pump he'd installed that connected to the well. The pump required effort, 40 strokes to fill a bucket, but the water was clean and cold and free. It was primitive compared to modern conveniences, but it was his, and that made all the difference. The barn became his next project. The structure was too far gone to save entirely. The collapsed section would need to be torn down completely and rebuilt, but James decided to salvage what he could. The main frame was still solid, those massive timbers that had been raised by his great-great-grandfather's generation. If he could clear out the damaged sections, shore up the foundation, and install a new roof, the barn could be functional again. He spent days pulling down rotted boards, clearing the interior of decades of accumulated junk. Ancient hay bales that disintegrated at his touch, broken tools rusted beyond recognition, old equipment whose purpose he could only guess at, even an ancient car from the 1950s, half buried under debris, its tires long since rotted away. It was like archaeological work, excavating layers of history, each discovery telling a story about the farm's past. It was during this phase, on a gray November morning that threatened snow, that Rex began showing unusual interest in a particular spot near the barn's foundation. James first noticed it while he was sorting through a pile of old lumber, pulling out pieces that could be salvaged, discarding those too far gone. He heard Rex digging furiously about 20 feet away, his powerful legs sending dirt flying behind him in great arcs, his focus absolute. "Rex, leave it," James called, assuming the dog had found a rabbit hole or caught the scent of some burrowing animal. Groundhogs had been a persistent presence around the property. Rex paused, looked back at James with his intelligent brown eyes that seemed to question why James would interrupt important work, then returned to digging with even greater enthusiasm, his tail wagging with excitement. James walked over, intending to pull the dog away before he dug up some underground hornet's nest or disturbed a skunk's den. But something made him pause. Rex wasn't digging randomly. He was focused, deliberate, using the same methodical approach he'd employed when searching for IEDs overseas, when a single mistake could mean death for everyone around him. This wasn't play. This wasn't a dog chasing prey. This was work, the kind of focused, purposeful work that military working dogs did when they'd found something. "What you got, boy?" James knelt beside the hole, which was already more than a foot deep. The soil here was different from the surrounding ground. Darker, less compacted, mixed with small fragments of stone and what looked like very old wood chips, as if it had been disturbed and replaced. His training kicked in, the pattern recognition that had kept him alive through 2 decades of military service, and James found himself analyzing the scene. The disturbed earth formed a rough rectangle, approximately 3 feet by 4 feet, too regular to be natural. The soil composition was wrong for this area, brought in from somewhere else. Whatever was buried here had been placed deliberately, carefully, hidden by someone who knew what they were doing. James retrieved a shovel from the barn, his heart rate increasing despite his attempts to stay calm, and began to dig carefully, widening the hole Rex had started. His military experience with explosive ordnance disposal, he'd done some cross-training early in his career, made him methodical. 6 inches down, his shovel struck something solid with a hollow thunk that echoed slightly. His breath caught. He dug more carefully now, clearing soil from around the edges of whatever lay beneath, using his hands to sweep away loose dirt, taking his time despite the cold and the threatening sky. What emerged was a large wooden chest, its surface dark with age and soil, but remarkably intact. The wood was thick, oak, James guessed from its grain and density, and held together with iron bands that had rusted but remained intact, doing their job even after decades underground. The chest measured approximately 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet deep. A heavy padlock secured the front, so corroded it looked like it might crumble at a touch, but still holding fast. For a long moment, James simply stared at his discovery, his mind racing through possibilities. Who had buried this? His great-uncle Howard? Possible, but the earth had been disturbed long ago. The tree root patterns suggested this had been buried for many decades, maybe longer. Someone before Howard, then. His grandfather? His great-grandfather? How long had it been here, waiting in the cold earth? And most importantly, what was inside? He lifted the chest from the hole with difficulty. It was surprisingly heavy, dense with whatever it contained, at least 80 or 90 pounds. Setting it on level ground, James examined it more closely. The wood bore no markings, no initials or dates carved into its surface, nothing to identify who had created it or why. The lock was old, possibly antique, a heavy iron mechanism that had fused with rust and corrosion. He could break it easily enough with the tools in his truck, but something made him hesitate. This was the moment everything would change. He sensed with the certainty of instinct. Whatever lay inside this chest had been hidden for a reason, buried deliberately and kept secret through the years. Someone had taken great effort to conceal it, to protect it, to preserve whatever was inside. Once opened, there would be no going back to the simple project of restoring a farm. He would be stepping into someone else's story, uncovering secrets that had been meant to stay buried, accepting a responsibility he didn't fully understand. Rex sat beside him, panting clouds of steam in the cold air, tail wagging, completely unaware of the gravity of the moment. The dog had done his job, found what was hidden, located the anomaly that didn't belong. Now he simply wanted praise, and perhaps a treat, the simple rewards of a working dog who'd completed his task. James ran his hand over Rex's head, scratching behind his ears the way the dog loved. "Good boy," he murmured, his voice tight with emotion he didn't fully understand. "Good boy. You found something, didn't you?" Then he stood, retrieved a bolt cutter from his truck, and returned to the chest. He examined the lock one more time, noting the craftsmanship, the weight, the care someone had taken to secure this container. Then he positioned the bolt cutters and squeezed. The rusted lock gave way with surprising ease, falling away in pieces, crumbling like the dried mud that surrounded it. James lifted the heavy lid, its hinges groaning in protest, metal scraping against metal after decades of immobility. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth that had preserved them from moisture and decay, were stacks upon stacks of items that made James's breath catch in his throat. He carefully lifted the first piece of oilcloth, unfolding it with trembling fingers, and found himself staring at what appeared to be old currency, but not regular bills. These were silver certificates, elegant notes from the 1920s and 1930s with ornate designs and denominations he'd only seen in history books. Beneath them were gold certificates, even rarer, promised notes from an era when paper money could be exchanged for actual gold at any bank. The bills were in remarkable condition, crisp and clean, their colors still vibrant. Beneath the currency were rolls of coins, also wrapped in oilcloth. James unwrapped one carefully and found himself holding silver dollar from the late 1800s, their surfaces still bright, protected from the tarnish that normally claimed silver. More digging revealed jewelry. Antique pieces set with stones that caught the weak winter light, even in the shadows of the barn. Pocket watches with intricate engravings, silver serving pieces that spoke of formal dinners and better times, and at the very bottom, several small leather pouches that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. James sat back on his heels in the cold dirt, stunned into silence. This wasn't just a buried box of old belongings. This wasn't a time capsule or a collection of family heirlooms set aside and forgotten. This was a fortune, carefully assembled and hidden. This was treasure, real treasure, the kind he'd only read about in adventure stories. His hands shook slightly as he began carefully removing items, laying them on the oilcloth in the cold November air. Rex watching with curious eyes as his human handled these strange objects that smelled of earth and age and metal. James spent the rest of that day carefully cataloging everything in the chest, documenting each item with photographs and detailed notes. His military training had taught him the importance of proper procedure, of maintaining chain of evidence, of documenting everything before making any moves. His instincts, honed through years of dealing with sensitive situations in hostile environments, told him this discovery needed to be handled carefully and intelligently. He brought the chest inside the house as darkness fell, storing it in his bedroom where he could secure it, where he could keep watch over it at night. He photographed every item from multiple angles, wrote detailed descriptions, noted any markings or dates he could find. The military had made him methodical, and now that training served him well. That evening, as he sat at the kitchen table with Rex at his feet and a camping lantern providing flickering light, James began researching on his laptop, powered by the generator he'd set up outside. The internet connection was spotty this far from town, but he could at least access basic information. He started with the currency. The bills dated primarily from the 1920s and 1930s, silver certificates in denominations from $1 to $100, and several gold certificates in $50 and $100 denominations. In their current form, as collectibles, they were worth far more than their face value. A quick search revealed that depending on condition, rarity, and year, these bills could be worth anywhere from $50 to several $1,000s each. He had dozens of them. The coins were equally impressive. Silver dollars from the late 1800s, Morgan dollars they were called, named after their designer. Mercury dimes from the 1920s and 1930s, their silver content alone making them valuable. Walking Liberty half dollars in near mint condition. Standing Liberty quarters. And gold coins, double eagles, $20 gold pieces that weighed nearly an ounce each. James counted 50 of them, each one potentially worth more than $1,000 at current gold prices, more if they had numismatic value as collectibles. The jewelry was harder to assess without an expert, but even to James's untrained eye, the pieces looked valuable and authentic. Several were clearly antique, featuring designs and craftsmanship from the early 20th century or earlier. The stones he thought he saw emeralds, possibly diamonds, maybe rubies, caught the lantern light with an internal fire that seemed too bright to be glass or paste. James leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what Rex had discovered. This was wealth, real wealth, the kind that could transform his life, that could restore this entire farm and leave him with resources to build something lasting. But it also raised questions, complicated questions about ownership and taxes and legality. And more than that, it raised questions about family, about the Sullivan history he'd never known, about the man who'd buried this treasure and the reasons he'd had for doing so. The next morning, despite his eagerness to learn more, James forced himself to continue his work on the farm. He needed to maintain normalcy, needed to think through his next steps carefully. But after lunch, he drove into the nearest town, a small community called Millbrook that consisted of little more than a main street lined with brick buildings from the turn of the last century. A few shops, a diner, a hardware store, and a coffee shop where locals gathered to gossip and share news. At the Millbrook Historical Society, housed in a converted church building that still retained its stained glass windows and vaulted ceiling, James met Margaret Thornton, a retired librarian in her 70s who seemed to know everything about everyone who'd ever lived in the area. Her office was cluttered with boxes of photographs, shelves of local history books, filing cabinets stuffed with documents and records. When James mentioned he'd inherited the old Sullivan farm, her eyes lit up behind her reading glasses. Howard Sullivan's place. Oh my, I remember that farm from when I was a girl. Your great-uncle was quite a character, though he kept to himself mostly, especially in his later years after Louise died. Margaret stood and began pulling out several leather-bound volumes from a shelf, local histories compiled over decades by volunteers and amateur historians. But the Sullivan family goes way back in these parts. Let me show you something. She opened one of the volumes to a page marked with a faded ribbon, handling the old book with the care of someone who understood its value. Here, Thomas Sullivan, that would be your great-great-grandfather, I believe. He established that farm in 1882, came over from County Cork in Ireland with nothing but the clothes on his back and enough money for land and seed. Built quite a successful operation over the years. By the 1920s, the Sullivans were one of the more prosperous families in the county. Had cattle, grew wheat and corn, even had an apple orchard that was known for producing the best cider in 3 counties. James leaned forward, studying the old photographs that filled the page. A stern-faced man with a thick beard and work-worn hands stood before a barn. His barn, James realized with a jolt, before decay had claimed it. The barn looked magnificent in the photograph, freshly painted, its roof intact, its massive doors open to show the interior filled with hay bales and equipment. Beside Thomas stood a woman in a high-necked dress, her expression serious but with a hint of smile around her eyes, and 3 children in their Sunday best, staring at the camera with the wide-eyed wonder of those encountering new technology. What happened to the family? James asked, his voice quiet. How did they go from prosperous to whatever my great-uncle became? Margaret's expression grew somber. Hard times. The Depression hit everyone hard, but farmers especially. Crop prices collapsed, banks started failing and calling in loans, and people lost everything they'd worked for. There were rumors around town, just gossip, mind you, but persistent gossip, that Thomas Sullivan didn't trust banks. Some said he'd seen the financial collapse coming and had converted his wealth to gold and silver and hidden it somewhere on the property. But that was probably just local legend. People love a good buried treasure story, especially during hard times. It gave them hope, I suppose, the idea that somewhere out there, someone had beaten the system. James kept his expression carefully neutral, years of military training helping him conceal the excitement racing through his veins. Did my great-uncle Howard ever mention anything like that? Any family stories about hidden treasure? Howard! Margaret shook her head, her gray curls bouncing slightly. Howard barely spoke to anyone after Louise died in 1996. Cancer, poor thing, took her quick. After that, he became increasingly isolated, some say a bit senile. He'd come into town maybe once a month for supplies, always paid in cash. I remember that because it was unusual even back then, most folks used checks or cards. Sometimes he'd mutter about protecting the family legacy and keeping faith with the old ones, things like that. We all assumed he meant the land itself, keeping it in the family, not selling out to developers like so many others did. James spent another hour with Margaret, learning about his family history, about the farm's better days, about the community that had grown and changed around it. She showed him more photographs, the Sullivan family at church socials, at county fairs, at harvest celebrations. She gave him photocopies of several historical documents, the original land deed from 1882, tax records showing the farm's value over the decades, even a newspaper clipping from 1929 about Thomas Sullivan's prize-winning bull at the county fair. When he finally left, carrying a manila folder stuffed with copies and photographs, James had a much clearer picture of who the Sullivans had been and what the farm had meant to them. But he also had confirmation of what he'd suspected. Thomas Sullivan, his great-great-grandfather, had been the kind of man who would have seen the Depression coming, who would have protected his family's wealth in unconventional ways, who would have buried a treasure and kept the secret close. Back at the farm, James made the decision he'd been wrestling with since the discovery. He needed professional help. An appraiser who could properly evaluate what he'd found, someone discreet and trustworthy who could give him accurate information without spreading the news all over the county. He also needed a lawyer who could advise him on the legal implications. The items in the chest might technically belong to the estate, might have tax implications, might even have historical significance that required special handling. He spent the next 2 days making calls, asking for recommendations, checking credentials. Finally, he found what he was looking for. Richard Shunn, a numismatist and antique dealer based in Pittsburgh with an impeccable reputation and, more importantly, a professional obligation to client confidentiality. James sent him only the most basic information, that he'd found some old currency and coins on inherited property and needed them evaluated. What he didn't mention was the extent of the find. That would wait until they met in person, until James could assess the man's character and decide how much to reveal. Trust was something James had learned to ration carefully during his military service, something to be earned rather than freely given. As he made preparations for the appraiser's visit, cleaning his bedroom to create a professional space for the evaluation, James reflected on how quickly his life had changed. A month ago, he'd been a recently retired Marine with no clear purpose, living in an apartment that felt more like a way station than a home. Now he was the owner of a historic farm, the guardian of a family legacy he was only beginning to understand, and the possessor of a fortune that had waited in darkness for nearly a century to be discovered. Rex, oblivious to the complications and consequences of his discovery, spent his days as he'd spent every day since arriving at the farm, patrolling the property, chasing squirrels, and occasionally returning to the spot near the barn to sniff where he'd made his remarkable find, as if confirming that yes, he had indeed found something extraordinary, and yes, he was indeed a very good dog. The appraiser arrived on a cold December morning when frost still clung to the grass, and the clouds hung low and gray with the promise of snow. Richard Shunn drove up in a nondescript sedan that seemed deliberately chosen to avoid attracting attention. He was perhaps 50, with graying hair and the careful movements of someone accustomed to handling valuable objects. James had sent him only the most basic information, but as Richard stepped out of his car and looked at the restored farmhouse with an appraiser's eye, James could see him already calculating, already forming impressions. James had set up the items in the house's old dining room, laying them out on sheets he'd spread across the heavy oak table that had come with the house. He'd cleaned the table thoroughly, removed years of dust and grime, and now it served as a display surface for the contents of the chest. As Richard entered and saw the extent of what James had found, his professional composure slipped for just a moment. His eyes widened slightly, and he set down his equipment case with more care than necessary, as if he needed a moment to process what he was seeing. "Mr. Sullivan," he said slowly, his voice carrying a note of genuine awe, "when you said you'd found some old currency and coins, I assumed you meant a few bills in an attic trunk, maybe a small collection someone had put together and forgotten. I've done dozens of estate evaluations like that. This," he gestured at the table laden with currency, coins, and jewelry. "This is something else entirely. This is a significant find." Over the next 4 hours, Richard examined every item with meticulous care. He photographed each piece from multiple angles, made detailed notes in a leather-bound journal, consulted reference books and online databases, constantly cross-referencing what he found with historical records and current market values. He used a jeweler's loupe to study the coins, examining their mint marks, looking for signs of wear or damage, assessing their grade with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades in the field. He weighed them on a precision scale he'd brought, measuring to the 10th of a gram. He evaluated the currency for condition, rarity, and authenticity, using a UV light to check for security features and signs of counterfeiting. Though currency this old predated most modern anti-counterfeiting measures. James watched in silence, Rex sleeping at his feet, occasionally rising to check the windows when a bird flew past or the wind rattled the glass. The morning stretched into afternoon, the weak winter sun making its low arc across the southern sky, and still Richard worked, his focus absolute, his attention to detail impressive. The silver and gold certificates, Richard explained as he worked, were worth significantly more than their face value as collectibles. The market for these had grown steadily over the years as collectors sought pieces of American financial history. These silver certificates, he said, holding a crisp $5 bill up to the light, could be exchanged for actual silver dollars at any bank until 1968. People collected them because they represented real wealth, real metal, not just a promise. and gold certificates. He set down a $100 gold certificate with obvious reverence. These were discontinued in 1933 when FDR took the country off the gold standard. After that, it was actually illegal to own them for a while. The ones that survived became incredibly valuable to collectors. He examined each bill carefully, noting its series, its condition, any unique characteristics. You have bills here ranging from the 1890s to the 1930s. Most are in remarkable condition. This oilcloth wrapping protected them from moisture and air, preserved them almost perfectly. Depending on rarity and year, these range from $50 to $500 each. You have, he counted carefully, 63 individual notes here. Conservative estimate, $8,000, possibly more if we find a specialized collector for some of the rare pieces. The coins told a more impressive story. Richard examined each one with his loupe, checking the dates, mint marks, and condition. Morgan silver dollars from the 1880s and 1890s. He murmured, his voice taking on the enthusiasm of a true collector. Several rare dates here. This 1889 CC Carson City Mint, in this condition, that alone is worth at least $500. And these Mercury dimes, walking Liberty halves, the silver content alone makes them valuable, but as collectibles, especially in this condition. He made notes, consulted his reference books, calculated values. The gold coins, particularly the double eagles, $20 gold pieces, were the crown jewels of the collection. Each weighed nearly an ounce of pure gold, but their value went beyond mere metal content. These are St. Gaudens double eagles, Richard explained, holding one up to show James the beautiful relief of Liberty striding forward with torch and olive branch. Considered by many to be the most beautiful coin ever produced by the United States Mint. You have 50 of them, various dates from 1907 to 1928. At current gold prices, just the metal content makes each one worth about $2,000. But as collectibles, especially these earlier dates in this condition, they're worth significantly more. Some of these could fetch $3,000, even $4,000 to the right buyer. James felt his mouth go dry. 50 gold coins, each worth several $1,000s. He'd known they were valuable, but hearing the actual numbers was different, made it real in a way that abstract knowledge couldn't. But it was the jewelry that provided the biggest surprise. Richard examined each piece with increasing interest, using his loupe to study the stones and settings, checking for makers' marks and hallmarks. Mr. Sullivan, these aren't just family heirlooms or sentimental pieces. These are investment-grade jewelry from the early 20th century. This brooch, he held up a stunning piece featuring green stones in an intricate platinum setting. These are genuine emeralds, likely Colombian based on their color, surrounded by what I believe are diamonds. The workmanship is exquisite. This is from the Art Deco period, probably 1920s. Worth several $1,000s at least. He picked up a pocket watch, opened it carefully, and let out a small gasp. Patek Philippe, one of the world's premier watchmakers. This is from their golden age, probably 1910s or early 1920s. The movement alone. He showed James the intricate mechanical workings visible through the open back. This is haute horlogerie, the highest level of watchmaking, even if it doesn't run. And we need a specialist to assess that. This is worth at least $5,000, possibly $10,000 to a serious collector. Several rings bore hallmarks indicating they were crafted by renowned jewelers from the early 20th century. A necklace featured what Richard believed were natural pearls, not cultured, making them extraordinarily valuable. Each piece told a story of wealth carefully converted into portable, valuable objects, jewelry that could be worn or sold, that would hold value regardless of what happened to banks or currencies or economies. This wasn't just someone collecting pretty things, Richard said thoughtfully, examining a diamond ring that caught the winter light streaming through the window. This was someone systematically converting wealth into forms that would survive economic collapse. Someone who understood that when paper money failed, gold and gems would still have value. Someone who'd learned hard lessons about trusting institutions. When Richard finally finished his assessment, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He sat back, removed his glasses, and cleaned them slowly, as if giving himself time to compose his thoughts and double-check his calculations. "Mr. Sullivan," he said finally, meeting James's eyes with a serious expression, "I need to be very careful with this estimate because some of these items could fetch significantly more at auction with the right buyers, or substantially less if flooded onto the market all at once. But conservatively, taking into account current precious metal prices, numismatic values, and the jewelry market, you're looking at a total value between $42,000 and $48,000. Some individual pieces, these gold double eagles, this Patek Philippe watch, several of the jewelry pieces, could potentially bring higher prices from specialized collectors. But that's a conservative, reliable estimate of what you could expect to receive if you sold everything tomorrow." James felt something release in his chest. Not excitement exactly, though there was that too, but a kind of relief mixed with awe. $42,000 minimum. It wasn't lottery-winning wealth, not the kind of money that would let him retire to a beach and never work again. But it was significant. It was enough to fully restore the farm, to invest in proper equipment and infrastructure, to build something lasting. It was enough to honor the legacy that Thomas Sullivan had worked so hard to preserve, to continue what his ancestors had begun more than a century ago. "What about taxes?" James asked, his practical nature asserting itself. "Legal implications? I need to understand what I'm dealing with here." Richard nodded approvingly. "Smart question. I'm not a lawyer, but I've dealt with enough estate fines to know the basics. Generally speaking, treasure trove, items found buried or hidden with no identifiable owner, belongs to the finder when discovered on their own property. You inherited this property, which means you inherited everything on it, including items the previous owner may not have known about. The estate's already been settled, probate closed, all claims satisfied. This likely belongs to you free and clear. But," he held up a hand, "you absolutely need professional legal advice. Tax implications, proper reporting, making sure everything is documented correctly. These are things you want to get right from the beginning." They talked for another hour as darkness fell, and James turned on the lights, powered by his generator. Richard provided contact information for a lawyer who specialized in estate law and unusual asset discovery. He gave James guidance on how to store the items safely. A proper safe was essential, insurance even more so. He offered to handle the sale of items if James decided to liquidate, explaining his fee structure and process with the transparency of someone confident in his reputation. Before he left, Richard paused at the door and looked back at the dining room, where the treasure still lay spread across the old oak table. "Mr. Sullivan, in 30 years of doing this work, I've evaluated thousands of estates, hundreds of collections. This," he shook his head, "this is special, not just because of its value, but because of what it represents. Someone in your family had the foresight and discipline to protect their wealth during one of the worst economic crises in American history. They succeeded, and now, nearly a century later, you've found it. That's not just treasure, that's legacy." After Richard left, James sat alone in the dining room with Rex at his feet, staring at the items that had emerged from the earth after so many years in darkness. The currency and coins, the jewelry and watches. Each piece was a decision made by Thomas Sullivan, a choice to trust gold and gems over banks and paper promises. Each piece represented labor, sacrifice, the determination to protect his family's future, even if he wouldn't be there to see it. James thought about the man who'd buried this chest, his great-great-grandfather Thomas. A man who'd come from Ireland with nothing, who'd built a prosperous farm through decades of hard work, who'd seen the warning signs of economic collapse and acted to protect what he'd built. Had he planned to tell his children where the treasure was hidden? Or had death taken him before he could pass on the secret? Had generations of Sullivans lived on this farm, never knowing that wealth lay buried beneath their feet? And Howard, his great-uncle, the man who'd left him this property, had Howard known? Was that why he'd held onto the farm even as it fell into disrepair around him, refusing to sell even when offered good money by developers? Had his cryptic comments about protecting the family legacy meant more than Margaret Thornton had understood? James sat with these questions for several days, not rushing into decisions, thinking through his options carefully. He could sell everything, take the money, and invest it elsewhere. He could restore the farm minimally and sell the property, turning a profit on his unexpected inheritance. He could hold onto the treasure as investment, keeping it in reserve against future need. Or he could do what his heart had been telling him to do since the day he arrived. He could stay, he could build, he could honor the legacy that had been passed to him. The lawyer confirmed Richard's assessment. The estate had been properly probated, all claims satisfied, all debts paid. The treasure, having been buried on property James now owned, was legally his. There would be tax implications, capital gains if he sold items for more than their assessed value, but no one could contest his ownership. The lawyer also arranged for proper insurance, helped James acquire a professional-grade safe, and advised him on documentation and record-keeping. In the end, the decision was easier than James expected. He sold approximately half the collection. The duplicate coins, some of the currency, several jewelry pieces that had no particular family connection, items that were purely investment vehicles. This gave him $23,000 in liquid capital after fees and taxes. The rest he kept, storing them in the new safe he had installed in a climate-controlled closet he'd created in the house. Some things, he decided, were worth more than their market value. Some things represented more than money. They represented connection to a past he'd never known, to ancestors who'd faced their own challenges and found ways to survive. With the money from the sale, James began the farm's transformation in earnest. He hired contractors to help with the major work he couldn't do alone. A complete new roof for the barn, professional electrical and plumbing installation throughout the house that met modern codes and safety standards, a renovated kitchen with proper appliances, a bathroom with running water, and a real shower instead of the camping setup he'd been using. He had the well professionally tested and installed a proper pump system. He repaired the foundation where it had settled, reinforced the structure where time had weakened it. He bought used but functional farm equipment, a tractor that actually ran, a brush hog for clearing overgrown fields, tools and implements he'd need if he was going to make this a working farm again. He cleared and prepared several fields, had the soil tested, and began planning what he would cultivate when spring arrived. The orchard got attention too. He hired an arborist who pruned the neglected trees, removed the dead ones, and gave him guidance on bringing the survivors back to productive health. But James also invested in something less tangible, something that mattered to him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. He created a small museum display in the house's front room, the parlor that had once been used for receiving guests. He mounted some of the bills and coins he'd kept in professional display cases with UV protective glass. He arranged the historical photographs Margaret had given him alongside documents showing the farm's history. He wrote out the story of the Sullivan family, the journey from Ireland to Pennsylvania, the building of the farm, the Depression-era decision to hide wealth in the earth, the decades of waiting, and finally the discovery made by a veteran and his dog. It was a private display, just for him and for visitors who might one day come, but it connected him to his past in a way he'd never experienced. For the first time in his adult life, James felt like he belonged to something larger than himself, part of a story that stretched backward into history and forward into an unknown future. On Christmas Eve, as snow began to fall across the farm in thick, heavy flakes that accumulated quickly on the ground, James sat on the newly repaired front porch with Rex beside him. The house glowed with warmth behind them, lights shining from windows that no longer leaked cold air, heat from a properly functioning furnace, keeping the interior comfortable. The barn stood solid and straight against the darkening sky, its new roof shedding snow, its structure sound for another century if properly maintained. In the fields, now cleared and prepared, he could see the future taking shape, crops in summer, perhaps some livestock, maybe eventually the apple orchard producing again. He thought about the strange chain of events that had brought him here, the unlikely series of coincidences that had transformed his life. A great-uncle he barely remembered, leaving him property he'd never seen. A dog's instinct to dig in one particular spot among the hundreds of acres he might have chosen. A family secret buried for generations, waiting for someone to uncover it. And underneath it all, the simple human desire to protect what mattered, to preserve wealth for future generations, to leave something behind that would endure. Thomas Sullivan, his great-great-grandfather, had buried that treasure nearly a century ago, probably during the darkest days of the Depression when banks were failing and the world seemed to be ending, hoping his family would one day have need of it. He couldn't have imagined that it would be a combat veteran and his military working dog who would finally uncover it, but that would help restore the farm he'd built with his own hands so long ago. He couldn't have known that his decision to hide wealth in the earth would eventually provide exactly what was needed to save his legacy from complete decay. But somehow, impossibly, it felt right. James was a Sullivan, even if he'd only recently learned what that meant, only recently connected to this history. And this farm, this land, was his responsibility now. Not just the soil and structures, but the legacy itself, the continuation of something his ancestors had begun and sacrificed to preserve. Rex's tail thumped against the porch boards, and James realized the dog was watching him with those intelligent brown eyes, somehow seeming to understand that something significant was happening, even if he couldn't grasp the details. Rex had been trained to find things, to detect what was hidden, to alert his handler to dangers and anomalies. But in finding this treasure, he'd done more than complete a task. He'd connected James to his past, provided the means to build a future, given purpose to a man who'd been searching for it. "Good boy," James said, his voice thick with emotion, scratching behind Rex's ears in the spot that made the dog's leg twitch with pleasure. "Good boy. You found us a home, didn't you? You found us a place where we belong." As darkness settled over the Pennsylvania hills and the snow began to accumulate on the fields, transforming the landscape into something clean and new, James Sullivan sat with his faithful companion and felt something he hadn't felt in years, maybe in his entire adult life. He felt like he belonged somewhere, not just physically present, but truly connected to a history, a family, a place. The treasure Rex had unearthed wasn't really the money or the gold or the antiques, valuable as they were. It was this feeling of connection, of purpose, of home. It was the knowledge that he was part of something that had begun before him and would continue after him, that his life had meaning beyond survival, beyond just getting through each day. The abandoned farm was abandoned no longer. The fields that had gone wild would be productive again. The Sullivan name, nearly forgotten in Millbrook, would be spoken again with respect. And the legacy that Thomas Sullivan had worked so hard to protect, burying his wealth in the earth with hope that someday, somehow, it would serve its purpose. That legacy had found its keeper, its guardian, its continuation. In the distance, an owl called across the snowy fields, its voice carrying in the cold, clear air. Rex's ears perked up, his body tensing slightly, the instincts of a working dog never fully dormant. But he didn't leave James's side, didn't abandon his post. They sat together in the quiet winter evening, guardian and companion, veteran and war dog, both of them finding in this place something they'd been searching for without knowing it. Tomorrow, James would continue the work. There was always more work on a farm, endless tasks that needed attention, repairs to be made, improvements to implement. But tonight, on Christmas Eve with snow falling and his dog beside him, James simply sat and appreciated what he'd been given. Not just the treasure or the money or the farm itself, but the chance to be part of something larger than himself, to continue a story that had begun long before his birth. And somewhere, he liked to imagine, Thomas Sullivan was satisfied. The old Irishman who'd crossed an ocean with nothing, who'd built a farm from raw land and determination, who'd survived prosperity and depression and everything between, who'd made the hard choice to bury his wealth rather than trust it to failing institutions. Somewhere, his spirit knew that his great-great-grandson had found what he'd hidden, and that the Sullivan legacy would continue. The snow fell heavier now, covering everything in white, making the world clean and new. Rex pressed closer to James's side, seeking warmth, offering companionship. And James wrapped his arm around his dog, grateful beyond words for the companion who'd saved his life multiple times in combat, who'd stood by him through the difficult transition to civilian life, and who'd now, through pure instinct and determination, uncovered a treasure that had waited nearly a century to be found. "Merry Christmas, Rex," James murmured into the falling snow. "Merry Christmas, boy. Best gift I ever got was the day they assigned you to me." Rex's tail wagged, thumping against the porch, and together they watched the snow transform the farm into something magical, something new, something full of promise for the future that stretched ahead of them.